Well, good afternoon, everyone. We all made it. Yeah, thank you. We made it till the end of the academic year. We have a good, what's it called? The last leg of a race. I can't think of what it's called right now, but you're the anchor person for our NP neuroprosthesis seminar series. So this is the last one until the fall. We're working on the speakers for the fall, and we won't have first Tuesdays during the summer either. So give you plenty of time to work on your research, get your dissertations written, and papers done. So it was a great year. So thank you for coming today. I'm going to introduce Hamid Charkar, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Well, thank you, Bob. Welcome, everyone. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Levi Hargrove. Dr. Hargrove is the director and scientific chair of the Center for Bionic Medicine at Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, which I had the pleasure to visit late last year. And it's an amazing facility, and I was truly impressed with the high integration of clinical care and research there. And as most of you know, Dr. Hargrove is a recognized leader in the prosthetics field, and his research is focused on development of clinically realizable myoelectric control system for people with limb loss. He has published in top scientific journals, including Journal of American Medical Association and New England Journal of Medicine. The list of Levi's Hargrove accomplishments is too long. I'm not going to go through all of them. I would like to mention that he co-founded a company named CoApp, and the company's focus is to translate machine learning approaches to prosthetic limb control. And since they started the company, about 2,000 systems have been provided to people with limb loss. So let's welcome our speaker.
Well, thanks. It's truly a pleasure to be here. My throat's a little hoarse, but hopefully I'll be able to make it through without having a coughing fit. But yeah, I'm really, really pleased to be here to speak about some of the work that we're doing at the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. And as Hamid mentioned, I did have a financial interest in CoApt, and all of the work that's going to be presented that has any relation to CoApt was performed while I did have an interest, but we recently sold this company to Hanger. So I no longer have a financial interest, but just bear in mind when you're looking at all of the results, those were done while I was involved with the company. So the Regenstein Center for Bionic Medicine was founded in 2006 by Todd Kuiken. It was originally called the Neural Engineering Center for Artificial Limbs. We have around 100 people in the group, more or less. It depends a bit on the time of year, if we have interns and how many graduate students are in the group. We have a large research portfolio, and we're really focused on translational research more than basic science, although we do partner and do some basic science as necessary. And we're located on the 11th floor, just on the northeast side of the building. So this would be a typical day in our lab. We're an integrated group in more than just name. So we would have a user. Everything is kind of centered around the user if you watch the video. The therapist is looking and talking, trying to translate their wants and needs to an engineering and scientific team who can kind of interpret what the user is asking for and make parameter adjustments. In this case, there's a very early development of a prosthetic knee ankle system, which you'll see later in some videos. But we don't necessarily speak the same languages between the clinicians, so it's nice to have the clinicians embedded in the team so that they can interpret what we should do from a scientific and engineering perspective to address the user's wants. So our group, there are 4 or 5 scientists in the group. There's myself, Arun Jayaraman, James Cotton, Megan O'Brien, and Kyle Embry is the newest member of our group. And we're mostly focused on wearable devices, machine learning, and community monitoring and therapy intervention, quantification of results. So these are the investigators. The team itself, I mentioned it was large. We kind of have it organized as in the scientific group. We have, the PIs. We have the academic team, which is the graduate students, postdocs, some team scientists. We have a large clinical team of therapists, prosthetists, occupational therapists, physical therapists. And then we have a technical team, which is, around 20, 25 engineers, professional engineers, or data scientists, for example, coders. And then we have an operational team. And the operational team is very important as well. They make sure that the center runs, things get ordered on time, things get coordinated, IRBs get submitted. So that operational team is a real important component. And we do have some writers that help us out as well. So they're a really important part of our group. So if I would say our areas of core competencies as a group are on machine learning and data science, mechatronics, design and control, and clinical trial execution, and kind of where these three things intersect would be our real sweet spot for the group in general. So I'm going to talk a bit about the clinical translation of the work we did in upper limb prosthetics, and that relates to COAP to some extent. And then I'm going to talk a bit about some of the older work we did with prosthetic legs, and then some of the newer work that we're doing with bionic or prosthetic legs. So the first part of the journey that I started in the field in 2003, so over 20 years ago. And in order to successfully translate this to routine clinical practice, it took 21 years. We really didn't get this kind of going, deployed, paid for, approved by the FDA, kind of full stop until April of 2025. So just recently. And so we started off with, lab studies, clinical evaluations. We'll go through some aspects of these or highlights of these in detail. So upper limb prosthetics, this group probably is well aware that the need is compelling. And even in spite of all of the media that we we lead the charge in showing how great our bionic limbs are. Sure, Ryan does, and I'm sure all of the leading organizations do as well. They highlight their work. The fact is that body-powered, cable-driven devices are still very, very popular devices. They're still very functional. They're easy to control, but they do have limitations in how many degrees of freedom they can control. But the ones that they do have, they're very easy to operate. They're inexpensive and durable. We'd focus more on the myoelectric prostheses. So these are EMG-controlled prosthetics. And this is an example of kind of the state of the art in the field when I joined, which is, they call it dual site control or agonist-antagonist amplitude control. So electrodes go over a flexor compartment or an extensor compartment, and the amplitude, whichever one of these signals is louder, that's the degree of freedom or the movement that gets operated. So if the flexors are louder than the extensors, the hand closes or the wrist rotates, and you can make pulses or switches or co-contractions to toggle between a rotator and a hand. So again, when I joined, this paper was just written by my advisor, Kevin Engelhardt, and he described kind of the state of the art in a machine learning style of control. So rather than relying on one muscle for one activity, he put an array of sensors around in his case, the circumference of the forearm, and he applied data windowing and feature extraction and pattern classification using a very simple statistical pattern classifier. And this paper has been cited probably a couple thousand times, if not more than that. It was interesting because they described this, and all of the analysis was done offline, meaning they collected some signals and did an analysis, and they said, we think this is going to perform well with actual patients and actual users, but it remains to be seen by implementing this and testing it. And they suggested that they could use virtual reality prosthesis as the first step in moving that translation. So instead of recording signals and doing an analysis, maybe we can record the signals, use a desktop-based computer to decode the movements in real time and illustrate what the person was trying to do, and then with the ultimate goal of translating it to real users using real devices. And that took a long time. The other thing that was going on right when I joined the field was Todd Kuiken, who's my mentor and founded the Center for Bionic Medicine. He had the idea called targeted muscle reinnervation. I'm not going to spend too long talking about targeted muscle reinnervation, but it is an important concept. So the idea was that machine learning style of control works pretty well if you have the muscles to read the EMG signals from. But if you had a proximal level amputation, like at the shoulder or even at the humeral level, you don't have the forearm muscles to measure those EMG signals from. So his idea was to surgically move the remaining nerves to muscles that you did still have remaining. In the case of Jesse Sullivan, the first recipient, he moved the 4 main nerves through the brachial plexus onto the pec. So they segmented the pec, and then they reinnervated it with different the different nerves. The idea being that these nerves would grow into the muscle, and then the person could think about making the physiologically appropriate movement, and then we could detect signals from that muscle using surface electrodes and control a prosthetic limb. This is what the surgery looks like. This is actually a fairly straightforward surgery. It's a little more complicated at the shoulder level, but at the transhumeral level, and it's done at legs as well. The plastic surgeons can do this. It's usually a day operation, and people can be sent home that day or the next day. It's not a technically complicated surgeon for a nerve surgeon. So this is what it looks like after it's done. So these are the area that the prosthetist located would be ideal for electrode placements if they wanted to use the amplitude control of the first video that I showed. So they basically said we could put one electrode here, and that would control elbow going up and down, and we can put the 2 other electrodes in the 2 other reinnervated sites, and you could directly map open and close. So this allowed someone like Jesse to do elbow up and elbow down, open and close in a much more intuitive manner than he could have otherwise done this. And one of the beauties of this surgery was they didn't really know how well it was going to work, but what they did know is that if it did work, components that were commercially available of the day could be used. You could use a Boston elbow and you could use an Autobach hand, and Jesse could immediately get benefit, which was an important consideration in doing this in humans the first time. And so this is a video of Jesse using the device kind of immediately after. On the one that he's controlling it easy is with TMR. The one that he's not controlling it is easy with. He's got a little joystick on his shoulder blades, and he's hitting FSR pads, and then he's using his chin to switch between an elbow and a hand. And that was kind of the best that could be done using well-trained clinicians. And so this was done with Jesse and then with a number of other individuals, both at the shoulder and transhumeral level, and all of them had very, very compelling performance improvements as measured through simple tasks like a clothespin test or a box and blocks test. So very promising. So we started to take the machine learning ideas that Kevin Engelhardt had published about and that I did my PhD work on, and I moved to Chicago, and we started taking some of these control ideas and again, developing this virtual reality limb, and then making the decoder work in real time. And we would analyze how well some of this reinnervated signals would work. And the details of the levels achieved are not important. What is important is that it was a very promising approach to be able to decode more than just elbow up and down and hand open and close. From that reinnervated signal, using a modest number of electrodes, something on the order of 8 to 12 pairs of EMGs, we could look at wrist rotation and a variety of different hand postures that the person might be able to do, Jesse and many other people who have undergone this procedure. And from there, we started translating this from being a virtual reality system. This was at the time the DARPA initiative was going on, so the Luke arm and our Revolutionizing Prosthetics work was being done. And so we would start merging some of these pattern recognition approaches with other control approaches, and we would start to see, at least in principle, that we could restore many movements for these individuals. But it was really difficult this is in a lab, there's a team of people that are helping do this work. And doing the clinical deployment, we were limited. So figuring out how we were going to translate this work This was the key step that allowed us to move outside of the lab. We couldn't rely on a computer to train these machine learning controllers. Apps at that point weren't a thing. Smartphones were just becoming available, but you couldn't pull out your phone and have an app to recalibrate your prosthesis. So what we did was we had a procedure we called Simon Says. So basically, we call this device-guided training or prosthesis-guided training. So the person would initiate a switch, and for around a minute, the device is in control, and the person knows after they hit the button that they follow along with the device. So whatever the device does, they do, and that allows us to label the data, and with an onboard microcontroller, we could train the machine learning algorithm or recalibrate it. And then we started doing simulated life cycle testing, where we would put faulty electrodes in and unplug electrodes, and the person would just use the device, and if it wasn't working well, they could just refresh the controller whenever they want. It's like, it's not working how I want it, I can recalibrate it. And this was a way that allowed us to move from the lab in the clinic and do home trials. So this was probably, at that time, the most important factor that allowed us to get out of the lab. And it's really the only thing that we patented that was kind of associated with CoApt, right? So the rest of it was published or publicly available, but this was the one piece of IP that we eventually licensed. So from that, we were able to do home trials. This was the first person that got sent home with a pattern recognition system, at least from the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. You can see the socket we call it lumpy, but he has a trained system, and he's using it, no sensory feedback, only visual feedback, and he's doing control of a 2-degree of freedom wrist and a hand. This is a Michelangelo hand, which has 2 hand postures. And so he's able to use this in the lab, and then we send it home so that he can use it at home for I think he was home for 28 days or something. So we looked at how often he would calibrate the device when he was at home, come back and do pre and post testing to see if he improved using the device when he was home. Those were the types of experiments that we were working on. So from there, we started to try to make the lumpy. Lumpy was okay for lab-based studies, but lumpy was not okay for the general person who didn't want to participate in an IRB-approved experiment. If we just wanted someone to use a prosthesis like this, we had to miniaturize and embed, and we started doing the work. And so for Jesse's arm, for example, that's a pattern recognition controlled arm that you wouldn't even notice unless you knew that we had swapped out the control system. So that was kind of the work that led to, we had people home, they liked it, they were functionally indicated that they were at least as good, and lots of people were a little bit better with the pattern recognition system. So that's when we decided to form the spin-out company. So we converted it to a product. This was around 2012. So it took from 2003 to 2012 to kind of do that whole body of work. And the first thing that we had to do was take this monstrosity, which is a backpack, control electronics, EMG, and we had to miniaturize it into a modular system that a prosthetist could assemble, right? So there's a control system, there's EMG amplifiers, and then there's an output to the device. So we made this into the CoApt, we called it the complete control kit, and it came in a box, and the prosthetist would, there was instructions of plug this into that and plug this into the prosthesis, and then here's how you should educate the patient. That was surprisingly not as difficult as you might think. That was actually a fairly straightforward engineering challenge. Doing the user interface on the software was even more difficult, right? So we had, like any good lab, we have numbers and knobs and widgets and settings, and you could probably fly a 747 commercial jet easier than you can operate this user interface. And so we had to hire a design firm who came in, and they sat and they watched people configure these devices for individuals, and they watched them use the control systems, and they watched the therapist instruct. And at the end, they gave us a design package, and the design package said, you need to make it no numbers, a couple of tabs. You have these parameter settings like window length, but we've watched for 60 hours and not one person has changed that parameter one time. Take it out. So we did this implementation science, human factors type of work to really simplify it. And so that was, again, a critical factor. When we started, there was one multifunction hand, which was the Touch Bionics iLim. That has grown. Now there are 25 hands on the market, 15 for sure, multi-articulating hands. And it would be awful nice if we, as an industry, could standardize things, but we cannot. And so each one of these hands have a different physical communication mechanism. So I2C and axon bus, and this one's just analog wires, and this one's CAN, and this one's UART. So we had to figure out a way that we could communicate with all of these various hand prosthetic components. And so what we did was we kind of, by hand, every time a new hand comes out, manually, every time a new hand comes out, we make a instruction for use in assembly and how these things need to physically connect to each other. And that's all implemented in a smart cable on the output. So each cable, there's like maybe 8 categories of cables, and they support a few different hands each. And that's the one customized component for all of these limb systems. The controller is the same, the inputs are the same, but the output is, the cable is different, and how they connect to an elbow or a wrist or a hand, that's kind of what is customized. And it's even more complicated than that, because sometimes if you plug a hand, I'm not going to pick on anyone's hand, into a certain wrist and a certain elbow, it'll blow the fuse of the elbow, right? So only certain elbows and wrists are compatible with certain hands. This is all just to say that the clinical and commercial deployment of this was scientifically uninteresting, but man, was it ever a lot of work. And in the end, you get a real nice user interface. You get the task at hand in this case, and the person is able to demonstrate all of the various hand functions. Obviously not a individual with limb loss here, but just kind of shows in concept how the commercial system evolved. So we kind of got to the product. It ended up being a nice little product. And then we had to go through the regulatory aspects of this. So I think most people in this room know that there are several classes of devices from the medical devices from the FDA's perspective: Class 1, Class 2, Class 3. Class 1 being the least regulatory burden, Class 3 being the most. In all of these various devices, most powered upper limb prosthetics are Class 1, and they're exempt from this 510K process, which we have to submit to get clearance to use them. Now, when we first deployed this, the FDA classified us as a cutaneous electrode, even though we didn't sell electrodes as part of the kit. They said it connects to electrodes, so we're going to classify you as an electrode, and it's going to be 510K non-exempt, which was a bit of a surprise. And we interacted with the FDA, but in the end, our consultant said better off just to satisfy their concern and do the appropriate testing. Fortunately, we had a lot of data from the scientific background, and that was expensive, but not incredibly difficult. So we did a 510K submission and got that approved. The next thing was releasing it. This was kind of the fun part, and I really learned at this point kind of how the variety of clinics and the variety of practitioners and the variety of patients that you'll see. So if you're in the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, you're going to see well-trained clinicians, top-notch clinicians with lots of time to see their patients and instruct them on how things use. That's not the case at all prosthetic clinics across the United States, and it was kind of eye-opening with respect to the types of questions and the customer support that would be required to fit this. So that was eye-opening, but an important part of the journey as well. And then finally, we went through, this was, when did we start this process? We started this process in May of 2024. So about a year ago, we decided that we would apply for an L code. And an L code, for those that are unfamiliar, this is the way that durable medical equipment is reimbursed in the United States. I like this I know Hugh Hare a little bit, and we don't see eye to eye on everything, but I do agree with him on this quote. And it's, he basically says that regulation is not the problem in translating a lot of these medical device technologies. Reimbursement is the number one problem that's preventing these from widespread deployment. And I agree, our experience has been the same. The FDA was quite straightforward, although, a little bit of burden there, but not too bad. And so we joined a consortium of Autobach and IBT, who also sell pattern recognition controllers. And we put in an application, and we successfully received an L code that became official in April of 2025. And so that was kind of the end of the co-op journey for me. We kind of let go of the company rate just before that. Where we're going with this line of work is right now we have satisfied compatibility on the outside, right? So we have this approach to control all of the various hands, but on the input side, we want to also be compatible with all of the various technologies, including technologies that are perhaps developed here. So we want to be able to save, for example, the heartache of trying to disentangle all of the communication protocols, et cetera. And so that if you have a great implantable technology that gives you implantable EMG sensors or even the motor decoding, we can just pass it through to the various limb systems to get it on patients sooner. So that's kind of the end of the journey with respect to the co-opt part and the upper limb components. I'm going to talk about leg prosthetics because when I was hired in Chicago not to work on prosthetic arms. I was hired to work on prosthetic legs, and I just kind of fell into the prosthetic arm side of the work. I don't know if I was voluntold by Todd Kiken to work on it, but it worked out. I was happy to do it. But I was actually hired to work on prosthetic legs to apply the TMR control approach to prosthetic legs. And so I'm going to show lots of videos. I don't know if I'm going to show the video that they're working in the lab to collect right now that I hope that I'd be able to show, but I do have lots of videos. And I do want to say that I think they look pretty good, but you got to bear in mind that this is what can be done with an Autobach commercially available knee. And it is really, really impressive, right? So this is a knee disarticulation amputee using a microprocessor, probably an X3 or an advanced version of a C-Leg, if you're familiar with that. And you can see all of the various activities that this person can do. And I show this only to say that the bar is high, right? So bear in mind that this is the world's best prosthetic walker, right? This would be like Usain Bolt doing the 100-meter. This is a good user. And this person also has a knee disarticulation amputation. So he has his muscles in his thigh are attached to the condyles. So that's not always the case. Quite often, if you have a short residual limb, you can't do this. But Autobach gets a little free advertising, so and kudos to them because it is a fantastic device. The devices that we have been building we build our own and we test others. So we started off testing above knee prostheses that were developed by Michael Goldfarb's group at Vanderbilt. And then we started developing our own in partnership with other trainees at the time, but are now leading their own independent lab. So Elliot Rouse developed the open source leg. He started that work while he was at Shirley Ryan. And Tommaso Lenzi, who was at University of Utah, also built some beautiful leg, or designed them while he was working with us. And we continue to use those, and he's developed even newer, better, more capable legs since he's been to the University of Utah. But these are the devices that we typically use in our lab. And actually, the video I showed at the very start with the person talking about what they wanted their leg to do is kind of the one right there at the bottom left leg. That's what it turned into after around 8 years. So we've worked with a lot of individuals with transfemoral amputation or knee disarticulation, probably more than 75 at this point. I think we're up to like 84-ish. We number them and keep track. And there's a wide variety of individuals with different ambulation levels. So there are different number of years since post-amputation, different heights, different weights. Some are short residual limbs, very short residual limbs, as you'll see in one of the later videos. And they're mostly have been highly active individuals. So that means that Medicare classification level of K3 or K4. We're increasingly starting to work with K2. And I'll say, for, again, all of the videos that you'll see, on the K3 and K4, I don't know, despite our best efforts, if we've made any one of our users more functional by applying these powered knees. We have tested this now on 3 or 4 K2 levels, and they've all become more functional. So it's easier, it was more convenient to do the experiments with the higher functioning individuals, but they could walk on anything. It's only once we started to change our focus to the individuals with lower functional levels that we start to see the benefit of this type of device. More work to do, but that was demoralizing when we got to participant number 59 and we didn't have any improvement, but it was really good when we got to K level 2, 3 of 3, and we see improvement. So again, don't get discouraged when things don't go your way. Everything was kind of successful. This is the open source leg. This is a video from Elliot Rouse. This just shows, even though it's a very rigid robot, it can be controlled very transparently. So this is Ritz Cracker, one of his graduate students, is kind of, you program this to get out of the way mode, just showing how it can be controlled if you choose to do it that way. Yeah, it's not a fake, right? We don't actually control it that way. It wouldn't be very useful if you program the leg when you put weight on it and it just got out of the way. So we program it to behave like a mass spring damper system using an impedance controller. So we can adjust the stiffness value, we can adjust the damping value, and we can adjust the equilibrium position of the knee joint and the ankle joint. And our trick is figuring out what parameters we should put in and how we should adjust them in order to restore locomotion. So this is kind of, again, a video that one of Elliot's graduate students created and shared, just kind of showing how the device operates. And so we have a lot of different devices and we have a lot of different users, but across all of the devices, there are some common sensors. So they all have some load cell, some measure of load. They all have joint encoders that measure the position of the knee and ankle. They all have an inertial measurement unit built into the shank, typically into the shank, sometimes into the foot. And sometimes we measure EMG, sometimes we don't measure EMG. It just depends on the experiments that we're doing. But generally speaking, we are able to measure from a variety of these sensors. And again, we use a finite state-based machine controller, and it's a hierarchical controller. And at the high level, the high level, think of what are you going to do next? What are you going to do next? What are you going to do next? Walk, 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 upstairs, upstairs, walk, walk, walk. And we make those decisions around 5 times a second, roughly. The mid-level control is kind of what should the joint profiles be to replicate the activity that I just predicted. So what should the knee and the ankle trajectories be, or the stiffness trajectories and damping trajectories be to replicate that movement? And that gets closed around 200 hertz. And then at the low level, these are just motor control using mechanical engineering or electrical engineering control theory, closed loop current controllers, and they operate very quickly. So it's actually pretty easy to create a state machine that just walks. If you just walk, you can say, load on, make it stiff, cross over midline, change it to a swing, load comes off, bend the knee, get to some zero velocity, kick it back out. And that you can just do that forever. No, those are kind of denoted with the blue arrows around the state machine. It's a lot harder to predict what activity to do next. So when I want to transition from walking to stair climbing, for example, unless you stop and use a remote control, but if you want to do it automatically and seamlessly, making those predictions is quite tricky, or can be quite tricky. And so we use this approach that Helen Huang proposed when she was at RIC at the time. And she said, we'll use machine learning, but we will base the decision of what you want to do next on only certain points in the gait phase. So every time the foot comes off the ground, we'll make a prediction of what you want to do on the next step. And every time the foot makes contact with the ground, we're going to do a prediction of the next step. And that simplifies the machine learning approach by a lot. And so again, we know we have like a buffer of data, recorded data, and we can detect when weight comes off the device. When the weight comes off the device, we say, okay, I'm going to extract features from these signals, and I'm going to predict what the person wants to do. And then once I predict what the persons want to do, I can transition to the appropriate state machine controller for that activity. And we decided to do this at heel contact and toe off, and then we were trying to predict when the various activities needed to change. So this is an example of what happens, again, one of my cool videos. So if it didn't predict right here, the person would have just kicked the step. So it needed to predict the change so that the knee could flex more, so that the person could place it in a location. Similarly here, if it was still in stair climbing mode, it would hang up and he would not be able to bear weight on the device. Going down the steps, if it doesn't predict right here, it's to be too stiff and the person can jackknife over the device and fall down the stairs. Right? So we have to make these predictions so that we can swap in the best parameters. The spring needed to be a little more compliant, or the spring needs to be a little stiffer, or the equilibrium point needs to be adjusted. Same for walking up and down ramps and slopes and so forth. And so we do a pretty good job, but not perfect. Sometimes people don't notice if you make a wrong decision. So those parameters for walking and walking up slopes are so similar that even though you swapped in the wrong parameter, the person doesn't really feel it. Quite often they feel it a little bit. So this was, it was a little too compliant, and so it felt like they were walking in a hole because the spring wasn't stiff enough, the parameter was off. This one, he kind of is jackknifing over it a little bit. So these are really exciting experiments to take part in, because the leg could go wrong, the person could fall. They're nerve-wracking, to be honest. I just want to let it play through because there's one, well, not quite catastrophic, but would have been catastrophic without the this one. So he was going down the step and it changed into going up the stairs, right? And so the leg is not in a position to be able to bear that activity, and so it would not be good. Do you have a question, Blue?
Yeah, so does the system take into account like user adaptation and also changes in the muscle physiology as the musculature changes?
It does. So the system that we have implemented is, some of them use EMG, some of them don't. So our philosophy is it has to work really well without any EMG at all, just using onboard sensing. And then we have a two-stage system, whereas the one expert is the non-EMG system, and a second expert is the EMG system. And we always are trying to predict things in real time, but after they happen, we can measure what actually happened and compare it to our prediction. And if what actually happened was the same as what we predicted would happen, then we can do a small update to the controller. So this is something when people walk, it'll get smarter as they walk, but there is a risk that it will diverge as well. So we have to be really careful in the gains that we put on those controllers.
Because I was just looking at Heller's data and what that was basically.
Yeah, so we do EMG, if available, gets incorporated in there here through like a naive Bayes fusion. So probability of the non-EMG times the probability of the EMG, and we'll fuse it together if available. If not available, it just relies on the probability of the non-EMG control system. Yeah, yes, we should. We didn't back when we first started this. We wanted all instrumentation to only be on the socket. That restriction now we've alleviated in the lab because wearable sensors are so ubiquitous now that we can put foot switches and accelerometers on the other foot. We don't do that. We don't deploy that, but we do that in research now. But one of the constraints when we started was only instrumentation of the socket or the prosthesis. But times have changed.
So without any kind of a surveillance system, how do you know when you are transitioning from flat ground to stairs?
We so we don't. We make our best estimate, and then we rely on the user, which we train on all of these scenarios, to make any sort of compensation. So like we teach them if a mistake is going to happen, what it's going to feel like, and how to recover from it. So I will say that we're not good enough yet to clinically deploy these. We restrict some movements, and we're close, but we're not quite there yet because we don't have that solved. Yeah. So this training is incredibly important, right? It's teaching people how to use these devices. They're capable devices, but it's like jumping into a new car that's autonomous driving or semi-autonomous driving. It's like, what do I do when the steering wheel moves? People need to be trained how to use the capability of these devices. And we have a good therapy team to do that. So moving into some of our most recent work, the state machine, I drew a nice, pretty cartoon of the finite state machine. This is what it actually looks like implemented on our control system. These are the little blue arrows I was showing that I said were pretty easy to configure. And then these are the arrows that configure the transitions between the states, right? So you can imagine how difficult it is to configure all of these. Many of these are for safety reasons. Some of these are for other reasons, and some of them were probably put in, just never taken out. But it's a rat's nest, right? And so it's difficult to configure. So where we're going is really what we have is we have signals coming in, and they're processed by the state machine. We generate K, B, and theta, which are our impedance parameters of both the knee and the ankle. And then we convert that into a motor current using, just the impedance control law. So what we really have is signals in, motor currents out. That's where we want to go. Or signals in and impedance parameters out would work fine. So what we started to do is we started to replace this finite state machine with a deep neural network, right? So if we have examples of signals in and we have examples of K, B, and theta out, we can just train a deep network to learn that mapping. So we used a reasonably sophisticated neural network. This is nothing super fancy. It's a nice neural network. The postdoc that designed it was very proud of himself, and good for him. And it worked, right? So this is someone who is walking on one of these devices without using the finite state machine. It's just taking the signals in and then converting it to motor impedance parameters, not the motor currents. And so again, we trained it with everyone's data who walked on the state machine except for his, to see if it would generalize to his movements. And lo and behold, does a pretty good job. He can do stairs as well, stair descent. And so again, these are real exciting experiments to do when you don't know what the leg is going to do. And it's especially exciting when you put it inside of a black box controller, right? So that was cool, but if you think about it, all we really did was we just learned the finite state machine that we had pre-configured for all of our other users. So yeah, was it that important? It's cool, but how impactful was it? So the next thing that we did was we said, well, let's look at some of this open source data that various groups have published. And so this is, I think, Aaron Young's group and Bobby Gregg's group. They published some obstacle course-like data. And so we said, wouldn't it be neat if we could look at the data from the non-amputees and kind of translate it to the domain of our sensors and then use that data to train our machine learning algorithm rather than experimentally collected data from amputees. And this would allow us to look at more activities without having the amputees do the activities, and would really allow us to collect data from more people and for more activities, and reduce the burden on the clinical support. So in this case, we put in, rather than the experimentally collected data, we put in data from non-impaired individuals, and we modified the network topology a little bit. And it worked even better than the other data, which is, again, was quite exciting. And we're still pursuing this. Like, this is newish work. We have even newer work that we presented at ICOR that I don't have in my slides, but it's on this theme of moving away from finite state-based control and learning the embeddings of the sensors inside of the network itself.
So did I see a really natural snap on the D where it snaps forward and back?
Maybe.
I'm really at the beginning of the video.
You probably did, because this was trained with non-impaired biomechanics versus we configure. Yeah, I mean, hard to say. Again, we haven't quantified it yet. This is like we published it in a preliminary paper, but we have ongoing work to further quantify this, including with stance, phase, and deflection. But yeah, it's neat. And it's cool from an engineering perspective. The clinicians hate it, right? Because they can't individually adjust the dials of each movement, and it's too much of a black box. So we need to have we need to allow the clinicians some level of control over this, and we're working on that. The other real new thing that we're doing is osseointegration. So we're applying people that have osseointegration to powered legs, and we've only collected from one individual so far. And actually, it just turned out that Hamid and Ron were here this day this person was in. I can't remember if they're walking with the powered device that day or not, but this is that person, again, now clipping on the powered leg, using one of our, this was a finite state-based approach, not the black box machine learning approach. That's still too new for us to try on someone with osseointegration. We don't understand it well enough yet. But this individual, again, with a really short residual limb, is starting to be able to walk on the powered leg. And we're interested in understanding the perceived weight of the device, and there's some work to be done with osseoperception, lots of work to do here. But this was her first time trying to go step over step stair ascent, which is pretty interesting. And we asked her, what does it feel like? She's like, oh, it feels really weird. And not good, not bad, just really different. The motors vibrate a little bit, like you can feel some of the lower level control that people with sockets don't feel because it's filtered by the soft tissue, but they can kind of feel any sort of flutter in the motor. So more work to do there. But you start to see crouching and all sorts of different things. And this student here on the right came from Elliott's lab and was in our lab for like 4 months. And this was like her first day in the lab. And she's like, holy crap, you guys do a lot of cool stuff here. I'm like, you don't understand that we've been trying to do this for 5 years and you just happened to be here on the first day that we tried it. And then the rest of it was a.
So the flutter that you think is a problem, do you think they would become dependent on that? They know they get feedback from that, don't they?
They do. So I don't think it's necessarily a problem from the patient's preference perspective. I'm a little bit concerned about implant loosening. So it kind of loosening the osseo-integrated implant. But I think lots of work to be done on the utility of that type of feedback. But given that this was not our patient, the patient had osteointegration, and we brought them up from Alabama, we were a little nervous about that. But yeah, that's really the only concern that I had. And then this device, so this is our newest leg device, and this guy is getting osseo-integration, and so he came up. This is a really short device. It's designed to be waterproof, and it's really quiet. Those other devices are screaming loud, way too loud for anyone to use at home. But this one is really quiet, and it's short, and the inertia is very proximal. So for him, his feedback, and he was the first person that we had walk on it, and he gave really good feedback on on this device, even though it was not controlled quite as well.
I noticed in all these stair climbing videos on the way down, you have them place their foot like midway on the stair. Is that something that a clinician?
Can you say that again?
Oh, sorry. I
Yeah.
noticed in all these stair climbing videos on the way down, they place their foot sort of halfway off the stair. Is
Yeah.
that something that helps our controller,
So,
or is it
so on this
coincidental?
individual especially, they don't have an active ankle, right? So it's a stiff ankle, and it won't bend for them, so it won't dorsiflex. And so they're instructed clinically to put their foot halfway on the stairs to just pivot over. On some of the Vanderbilt legs, I won't go back, but on some of the Vanderbilt legs, you see the ankle is compliant and it does move. So with that, that's my last slide, but I said that I was gonna do this. I don't know if I dare. You're gonna be able to see it. They're in the lab. They are in the lab, and they just collected this. And so that device is so short that we can turn it upside down, and we can put the actual device above the knee so that all of the weight and inertia is, see if I can get it here. So he's sitting, and now the knee center of rotation is below the device. So all of the weight, like our quad muscles are up here and they control the knee. So all of that weight is proximal. And I think that I don't know why the video of Michael Jordan is showing up here. There we go. This is him walking on the device upside down. I'll download that, see if I can get it. And so they did an experiment today where they had him with the leg underneath in the place it would normally be, and then they compare it to when the leg is, the mass is all proximal, because we think, and we actually have tested it on ourselves, but we think that the perception of the weight is going to be way different if it's proximal, and we think that that's going to translate to metabolic benefits and all of that. So I did get the video just in time. I'm sure they'll send me a better one here in about 5 minutes. So like, that's the type of work that goes on in the lab, and they didn't realize there was a time change between, or they, I'm gonna blame it on them, but we didn't realize that. Yeah, so happy to take any additional questions.
Wait 1 second. Pick up.
A quick question, you may have said it already, but how does the leg know if the patient wants to go upstairs or downstairs?
So the input that the leg has is through the person's hip, right? That's the only, like it's attached from their hip through the socket. And so we get their EMG in some circumstances from the TFL and the quadriceps and the hamstrings. And then we get the way that they are swinging the device, so the inertia of the device kind of through the knee. And then we have to rely on training data to guess or predict what they're doing on the next step. So that combination of EMG with all of the other sensors on the device, we take a prediction of the most likely activity that they're planning to do, and that's how it's controlled.
So those patients, you said there are systems with no EMG. So then in that case, you cannot do that?
In that case, they have a very short amount of time where they're fighting against the inertia of the leg, and you can see that the current isn't what it should be, and it switches very quickly, like within around 90 milliseconds. And so it gives the appearance of a seamless transition, but from the person's perspective, they are fighting against the leg for a very short period of time, and then it corrects itself. Yeah.
So you mentioned, so back to this algorithm, that it's like Bayesian based. Have you tried hidden Markov models? Because it seems like that would be like a perfect application.
So
If you're allowed to say, I mean, maybe.
we have tried dynamic Bayes networks, which is kind of, in a similar vein as hidden Markov models. So we get the current state, and then we have a state transition estimate, but we implement it through a dynamic Bayes network rather than a hidden Markov model. And we've tried a variety of other machine learning approaches, but I wouldn't say that we've seen the dynamic Bayes network does help. So like incorporating time history and incorporating probabilistic transitions, we actually enforce that there's a very low chance after seeing the consequence of that transition from stair climbing to stair descent, we enforce a very low probability that that transition will happen, and that helps with the overall accuracy of the system.
Hi, I've rarely seen hand models that can do individual finger control besides index and the thumb. What prevents that from happening? And kind of separately, have you thought about any kind of implants on leg or upper torso muscles to kind of better harness their, I guess, activation?
So we have done, we have not successfully done individual finger decoding with individuals with limb loss. I do think that with implantable sensors, I think that that is a possibility. But the muscle crosstalk and the noise sources from surface EMG prevent us from reliably doing that. And we would rather, the patients would rather have a reliable controller and predictable controller that had less capability than one with more capability and was less reliable. And so we limit, we see what they can do, and then we'll scale back that. For implantable devices on legs, had an application in, want to put more applications in to do that, because I think that that is definitely a great idea and really promising. And so like the work that's being done here is ideally suited to merge with some of the work that we're doing, and we'd love to do that.
Awesome talk. Awesome talk. I was just wondering, like from the videos of the leg processes, like with the state transition, how much do you think is the role of having additional sensory feedback needed while they're getting a lot of sensory feedback from the pressure in the physical limb? Is there a need for this kind of task, or they're good right now without it?
No, I think there's a need. I think that some of the work that's being done in Switzerland is pointing to the importance of sensory feedback for lower limb prosthetics. I think for balance, I think for if you could know where your foot is in space for stair climbing, I think there's just a variety of reasons that I think would complement this. Like again, we're forcing people. It's adaptable to the people in a certain extent, but then we freeze it and we force people to adapt their behavior to the best we can do with the device. And that comes back to the predictability aspect over the advanced functionality device. So I think that there's a big role for sensory feedback in the lower limb, particularly as it relates to balance and proprioception, or at least knowing where your foot is in space.
Right, but like my concern is like with the short time scale that you have to make this straight transition and predictions, I was wondering how much provision I would have as a user to change or adapt.
So I actually think that we have more time than we constrain ourselves. We take that snapshot, but I think that you could make that transition over the course of a few hundred milliseconds rather than at a specific instant. If you could control that and grade the control of that, I think you have more time than just a simple snapshot. That's just how we constrain the system. But you could modify that, I think. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. I had hopefully a quick two-part question. The first is, so for the deep neural networks that you were using for the decoding the parameters for controlling the motor, for individuals with like a knee disarticulation amputation where their joint center is lower than on the intact side, when you were using data from like able-bodied individuals to decode that, was it able to kind of reconcile that difference in like femur height or cheek height?
We didn't investigate it systematically enough to know. Probably not, but we can't say. Yeah, I think people can adjust their gait in to a variety of bad control profiles if they're unilateral amputees, and I think they do adjust their gait in many of these circumstances. Yeah.
And then I was wondering if you'd be able to elaborate more on kind of the training that you provide for people when they're learning to use these systems, and maybe if you could hypothesize on if you kind of gave this training to someone who was just freshly new using prosthesis.
So when we started, we would have people do the exact same thing 10 times the exact same way, and then we would say 100% perfect. Now we put the system on as soon as we can, and we say try to trick it. So try to like immediately just go into these weird activities that would trick it. And again, now we're getting so that the baseline controllers are good enough that might take 10, 15 minutes to see what activities it does not know well. So we've moved from this prescribed circuit approach to turn on the controller and you just start doing what you want to do, and there's a therapist there with a gait belt that's kind of with them, but it's like see if you can make it fail. And that's getting harder and harder to do. In the lab, you go outside to the street in Chicago, and this happens within 3 minutes, right? But we'll get there. That's what we're doing now.
Yeah, Leo, that was fantastic. Thank you. Along the lines of what Zoe just asked, I have a question. I'm going to put you on the spot, and right after you answer the question. But how do you know when the machine is adapting and when the person is adapting, right? Because you have some wind up or some forgetting factor in your controller, and does it work? It doesn't work first time out of the box every time, right? No, and in my experience, when I was messing around with powered knees, there are all kinds of strange behaviors when people were using their muscles the way they used to with their old prostheses. We put this killer controller on based on the MES signal, and they'd be, doing a line dance that no one predicted. So just how do you know what the machine is smart enough, or it's the person getting smarter?
No, I mean the person is by far smarter than the machine. And so we freeze. We have two experts operating. One of them is frozen. And so the one based on the mechanical non-EMG does not adapt. And that just is static. We try to make it we pool data together across people, and we try to make that as smart as we can. But that is frozen from the user's perspective. The one that is allowed to adapt is the EMG one. And we trust, whether we should or not, we trust the other one as ground truth. And so that's how we enforce adaptation of the user, because they can change their signals only in a certain range to adjust back to the machine. So I would say it's that frozen controller gets smarter over time, but once the person is walking on it, it's frozen. Yeah.
I guess I want to put you on the spot, then I'll hand it over to Musa. But I see Baloo has left the building. I was wondering, I was amazed that the things you can do only from the sensors in the periphery, including EMG, which is the final common pathway. So what's your opinion about is there a limit to how good we can get in the periphery that's going to require a cortical approach to controlling the lower limb prostheses? Or, what's your take on the role of BCI and lower limb prosthetic control?
For lower limb amputation, I'm not sure. I think the game changes when you have a self-contained wireless BCI. And I don't know. I know that you have the central nerve, you have the spinal cord, which takes care of a lot of the unraveling of what's going on in the brain. So we take advantage of that to the extent that we can. I don't know how we're going to restore proprioception. And I think that that's going to be an important thing to restore. So that's kind of where I'm at right now, is we can't restore proprioception, and that would be really nice to know. where the foot is in space, so that you don't have to look down at the stairs. But I don't know.
There's no question. Good answer. Do you use your brain to watch?
I don't use my brain at all.
So I have one quick question. Have you thought about feeding back data from the current set of people using the device to the deep neural network so that it could improve its performance?
We do, yeah. So we not in real time and not online, but every time we collect a new subject, we'll pool them into the training data so that deep model is getting better and better over time. So what I presented at I-Core was how that work is evolving. And so we have different network topologies that allow that. Like, so we use a Siamese network and we use autoencoders, and by doing that, we're able to, we're making systems that generalize across devices and across people and across sessions. And so we're starting to pool all of that information to make I hesitate to say a foundational model of gait or anything like that, but a model that interprets lower limb amputee gait specifically. We are trying to do that. Yeah.
Okay, let's pause here. Let's thank our speaker.
Thank you. Great questions.